I promised we'd come back to look at the constructors on our reviews controller, so let's review again why we have two constructors. The first constructor is the constructor that MVC Framework uses. It requires you to have a controller with a default parameterless constructor, and it is inside of the default constructor where we instantiate a new ODFOODDB because we know we are running live and we need a real database connection. However, we also have to satisfy our unit test, so we provide a second constructor that lets someone pass in any object that implements IDB context, and the unit test will pass in a fake in-memory context. And this is a situation you'll often run into with unit testing. You don't want your classes under test to have hard dependencies and instantiate objects that are hard to test. So you provide a constructor that lets you inject these dependencies and give the controller something you have control over. This pattern is so popular that there are components available to manage dependencies for you, and these components are known as inversion of control containers. Inversion of control means the component, like the controller, isn't in control of its dependencies anymore. Instead, we're inverting control and giving something else the responsibility of giving the controller the objects that it needs to work with. It turns out also that the MVC3 runtime has extensibility points that allow these inversion of control containers to plug in and take responsibility for creating objects like this controller. And since an inversion of control container, I'm just going to call it IoC for short, knows how to instantiate objects with dependencies, then once we plug in an IoC container, we can remove this default constructor. And just to show you what would happen if I try to run this application right now, the MVC runtime will be very unhappy that this controller does not have a default constructor. So we'll come into the review section, and there's the exception, no parameterless constructor defined for this object. This is a problem that I can solve using NuGet, because many of these IoC tools that I've been talking about are available through NuGet, and there are several of these. There's one called Ninject. I'm going to use one called Structure Map. Specifically, I went to look for one called structuremap.mvc3. And here we found it. Let me click Install. As we've seen with NuGet before, that's going to bring down the assembly references and install them. This is also going to add an app start piece of code to my application. So this is a piece of code that's going to run before even the application_start event in the global file runs. And what it is doing is it is basically setting structure map to be the inversion of control container that the MVC runtime will turn to when it needs to instantiate or find a component. It's also going to add a little bit of code inside of a dependency resolution folder. And one of these files is called IoC.cs. This is basically where you configure the IoC container. And we're using structure map, but almost all of these IoC tools work the same way. You need to tell them where to find types to plug in to these things that need dependencies. For instance, the reviews controller. The MVC runtime is going to go to structure map and say, create me one of these. Structure map is going to look at this constructor and say, I need to pass in an IDB context. What should I pass in for that? This is where I can configure structure map and say that when you see something that needs an IDB context, and we'll just bring in that namespace, then what I want you to pass in is an ODFOODDB. So at runtime, when we're on the web server, structure map's going to be plugged in. It's going to be able to create controllers by resolving these dependencies, and I could keep listing additional for this, use that, inside of this code if we had more dependencies to manage, but we just have this one so far. And let's run the application. And what we'll find now is that I can go to the reviews and we can see the reviews, and this is just how easy it is to use these tools. You described how you want the dependencies managed at runtime, and it will figure out how to construct the instances of the classes that need these dependencies. And this isn't something we use at test time where we're explicitly passing in fakes, but this is something that is tremendously useful to manage dependencies for the production code. And it might look like that all this gave me was the ability to remove that default constructor. But if you dig a little bit deeper into IoC tools, you'll find that they're really wonderful to create flexible, pluggable applications that are very testable. They also handle very difficult scenarios that are problematic if you keep around default constructors that try to instantiate the default dependency, particularly when you get into those cases where you have nested dependencies. So the DB context needs a logger, and the logger needs an ISMTP server. It just goes on and on and on.